Hi, everyone. In today's episode of the Bryan G Real Estate Podcast, we're going to be talking about two things. We're going to be talking about the final walkthrough and also the key exchange. Now, these are two separate events, although sometimes they go hand in hand. I'm not only going to define what each thing is, but I'm also going to go into setting some expectations for both the final walkthrough, and the key exchange. And you'll know what I mean about setting expectations here in a little bit. But first, what is a final walkthrough? Well, in every purchase agreement out there, when you're the buyer, it's in your purchase agreement that says that you, the buyer, have the right to have a final walkthrough before the closing. And this happens at a couple different times. If we're purchasing a home and you're going to be getting the keys at closing, or there's no occupancy from the seller, in other words, the seller does not have to stay in the home after closing, and you get the keys at the closing, then we usually schedule the final walkthrough either the day before the closing or the day of the closing. For example, let's say that our closing is scheduled for Thursday morning at 10:30. The seller does not need to stay at the home. You'll be getting the keys at closing. So we'll schedule that final walkthrough either Wednesday evening, or we could do it Thursday morning, say at 9:30 on our way to the closing. Okay? So that's how we schedule that. Now, so what is the final walkthrough though? What are we looking for? What is the purpose of the final walkthrough? Well, as I said before, every buyer has the right to a final walkthrough before the closing. And oftentimes what I see is that buyers have questions in their mind. First of all, the reason for having the final walkthrough, quite simply, and I'm being a little jokey here, but is to make sure that the four walls are still standing. Okay. We want to make sure that the seller didn't throw any wild parties, right? Trash the home. I'm being funny, of course, but what if somebody was moving the sofa down the hallway and they put the sofa leg through the hallway wall, right? And put a little hole in the drywall, right? Or maybe they were dragging a wardrobe across some hardwood floors and scratched the hardwood floors, right? Basically, the final walkthrough is we're walking through the home for one final time before the closing, and we're inspecting the home in its general condition. So we want to make sure that nothing crazy has happened. Someone didn't, like I said, didn't break a window, didn't severely scratch a floor, didn't put a hole in the drywall, right? We're looking for things like that. I'm going to go into some detail of those things in a little bit here. But that's what the final walkthrough is. It's your last time as the buyer to go through the home before the closing to make sure that the home is in the same condition, or generally the same condition, as when we saw the home and when we inspected the home and when we submitted our offer. Because the seller is charged with maintaining the home, with reasonable expectations, maintaining the home before the closing or up until the closing or until you get the keys. Okay. The seller just can't trash the house. And then we have the closing, hand you the keys and be like, good luck. Right. Anyway, so that's what a final walkthrough is. And so when we schedule this, let's say the day before closing, right? I know that buyers have some questions going through their mind, right? Like, is the home going to be in presentable condition, right? This is on our way to the final walkthrough. Will the home remember, or will the home look like how I remember it, right? Will it look better? Will it look worse? Were there any repairs done, right? Is everything that's supposed to stay in a home still there? And that's a really key element of going through the walkthrough as well. If our list of, well, not if, the list of appliances that are supposed to stay with the house, that is something that we look for. Okay, we have the washer, the dryer, refrigerator, stove, microwave, right? Now some of these things are built in and they're going to stay. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we do look at those things. So we look at the appliances that are supposed to stay. Also in purchase agreements, or based upon what we negotiated, what else is supposed to stay with the house. So is it written in our purchase agreement, or did we put in the offer that we wanted the window treatments, not only the hardware, but also the fabric that goes with those things, right? So the final walkthrough is, what I do is I will review the purchase agreement. Sometimes I'll bring it with me and see, okay, here are the appliances that are staying. Here is the list of the fixtures and things that should stay with the house. Like I said, window treatments, things like that. We want to make sure that, blinds, anything permanently attached to the home is staying. And actually, let me just kind of define that for a minute. So there's two types of personal property in a house. There's chattel, and then there's fixtures. A fixture is any item or items that are permanently attached to the house. Couple of examples. The chandelier in the dining room, right? That is permanently attached to the ceiling. That's something that's not made to detach, right? It's not simply plugged in like a lamp, right? That chandelier in the dining room is a fixture because it's permanently attached to the structure. So if the seller wanted to take their favorite chandelier with them to the next house, well, then they should have written into the listing and replied to our offer in the purchase agreement saying that that chandelier was excluded, which gives them permission to take that with them. Okay, so we want to make sure that all of the fixtures are there. Anything that's permanently attached to the house or to the property. Now, here's something we normally don't think about too. What else is permanently attached to the property? Well, the landscaping. Okay, I had a seller that said, I have this beautiful Japanese maple in front of the house. I love this tree. I've had this forever, right, as a gift from my wife, and I want to take it with me to my next home. Well, that's great. We actually had to, in the listing, write an exclusion saying that we are excluding the Japanese maple in front of the house. That will not stay with the home. Now, why is that? This is just a plant, right? However, the roots of that tree are permanently attached to the property, right? Those roots are in the ground. Trees are not meant just to pick up and walk away with, right? Now, if it's in a pot sitting on a patio, that's different because that is not permanently attached. That is something that can be picked up and moved. And that leads us to chattel. Chattel is any personal property that is not permanently attached to the property or to the structure of the home. So, of course, a couple easy examples. That potted plant. That plant is just sitting there. It can be picked up and moved. The lamp, yes, it's plugged into the wall, but you can unplug it and take it with you. That's an item that's meant to be moved, right? So anything that is permanently attached to the house must stay with the home unless it's been excluded. And any personal property that is not attached, it is the seller's responsibility to take with them. They need to take their stuff with them, okay? It's a expectation that we have as buyers coming into a home in our final walkthrough that any extra stuff, for lack of a better term, has been removed by the seller. Okay, that home needs to be empty and prepped for you to move in to bring your stuff. so, so where do we begin? So, kind of like what I was saying earlier with with the questions that people have, is the home going to look the same? Maybe it's been several weeks since we've been there, since we had that home inspection, right? The showings and things like that. And, sometimes it can be kind of nervous anticipation of the final walkthrough from the buyer. Like, oh, I really hope we remember this as the dream home as we did. Now that may sound corny, but it is really true, right? In some cases where the seller is staying in the home after closing, they may have asked for 30 days after closing. So you could have had your home inspection 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the closing, and then the seller was staying in the home for another 30 days after that. So you're not seeing the home till 30 days after closing. Yes, it could be several weeks since you've seen the house last, buyers, right? And so, although you're excited to be getting into your home finally, you're also a little bit nervous to make sure that is it really the way I remember it? Has the seller maintained the home reasonably well for us, when we get there, that the home looks okay and in generally good overall condition, right? And as always, having the right mindset and setting our expectations before the final walkthrough will help us keep the right perspective when evaluating the general condition of the home before closing, right? So here are some of the things that we're going to see at the walkthrough that we may not have seen when the home was furnished, okay? Because now we're walking into an empty house, right? Or a mostly empty house, right? If the sellers are still finishing up their moving and things like that, the night before. Okay. So a couple things we'll find. One, discolorations and flaws in flooring. Once the furniture is moved, it's very common to see floors that have scratches, potentially gouges that weren't seen before, right? Carpets will show indents from the furniture sitting on them. We may also see some discoloration from where the carpet was shaded due to a large couch or sectional sitting in the space, right? Wood floors may reveal two different tones, right? Due to sun fading, the UV light that comes in through the window, right? You know, Once that is pulled up, the floor could appear darker in the area covered by the area rug compared to the spaces where it was exposed, right? Especially if they were closer to the windows where lots of natural light came in, right? So, yeah, we don't know what was under that sofa. When we had our home inspection, when we had our showings, right, we didn't necessarily pick up furniture and move it, right? The area rug was sitting there on that hardwood floor. And let's say you had a nice, great room with floor to ceiling windows and everything, which is beautiful, great for the view, and a home, and the floors could be in great condition. But that area rug with that natural light coming in, when that gets rolled up and taken out, and then we show up later, it's highly possible that, or highly probable, that there will be a color difference between what floor surfaces have been exposed to UV light and what floors were covered by area rugs or by furniture. And that also applies to the carpet as well, right? You'll get some sun fade on carpeting too. Not as much, but you will get some, depending on how old the carpet is and how long it's been there, right? The other thing we're going to see is we're going to see walls with imperfections, right? Once the mirrors and the pictures come down, suddenly things don't look so welcoming, right? Including, the now exposed walls, discoloration, right? You can get some sun fading on paint too of the walls, right? And sometimes you even see, due to a kind of dust or that sun fading, even an outline of a picture or a mirror that used to hang on the wall too. You can kind of see that there where the silhouette has been left and faded there. So, once again, I would like to review what is staying with the house, right? Before the final walkthrough, we will review again the listing and the purchase agreement to remind ourselves of what items are supposed to stay with the home, right? And which items have been excluded from the sale of the house, right? Any of those fixtures that we mentioned before. This fresh reminder will help us know with certainty what our expectations should be as to what is staying with the house. Now, what are some things that should not stay with the house? Well, um, I had a listing once where they had a paver patio installed out back, and they had left a pile of the paver stones, not big, maybe 2 feet across, no, 2 foot by 2 foot cube, right? These stacked little paver stones in the back of the garage, right? Well, the work was already done on the patio. Those were just extras, right, from what they ordered. Well, the buyer came through and said, "Hey, I don't want those stones there. Those things got to go." And you know what? They're right. Those had to go. And we made arrangements to do that, right? So that was some extra stuff there. Sometimes you have extra pieces of siding, extra pieces of flooring, maybe in the garage or down in the basement. No, some buyers don't mind that. Hey, thanks for leaving a few extra pieces of the flooring there. Not a problem. Some buyers will say, look, I want everything gone. I want that extra stuff out of here. I don't want the siding. I don't want those stones, right? I don't want the flooring, right? Please take all of that out. We want the house completely blank. Okay. So depending on buyer and seller, will depend on what stays. But generally, the seller should take everything that's chattel, everything that's not attached, should be taken out of the house and gone. Another thing that's sometimes left, which buyers sometimes don't mind, is touch up paint on the walls. If the house was freshly painted and looks really really nice, which is one of the reasons why we wrote an offer on the house, right? Sometimes there might be like a gallon or two of some touch up paint, maybe left in the basement or in the garage. Now, a lot of buyers will see that and be like, "Hey, thanks for leaving the paint." However, other buyers might say, "Look, I said everything gone. Take the paint with you," right? And they would be correct in saying that. But most people like to leave touch up paint because it is kind of a nice thing to do. But generally, we can kind of work that out beforehand. But that's just a couple of examples of things that are left behind. that buyers may or may not want, right? If there is an old workbench that's not attached but sitting there, some buyers may say, hey, thanks for the bench. And other buyers might be like, I don't want it. It's got to go, right? So these are all things that we look through or we're looking for at the final walkthrough, right? So we're looking at discolorations, the walls and in the flooring, right? Due to the sun fading, where pictures were taken down, you're going to see nail holes, right? You're going to see where, if the TV brackets were excluded, you're going to see holes where the TV brackets were, where a mirror was hanging, right? So we're going to see those imperfections in the walls, right? And then did they leave anything behind like touch up paint or extra siding or flooring or anything like that? Buyer, do you mind? Buyer, do you want it? Right? We'll talk about that while we're there. But those are the things that, common things that we look for. So I'm sharing this with you because if we have a reasonable expectation of when we're coming to the house, right? We know that we're going to see these things. And so that way it doesn't shock you, right? Because the home is going to look different. When you saw that furnished home, when we had the showings, had a home inspection, the home looked beautiful. That's why we wrote an offer on it, right? But with all of the furnishings out, it is going to look empty, bare, right? And it's going to have a much more stark look with these straight lines and plain walls and flooring, right? So knowing this coming in, it's like, okay, this is normal. This is what we're going to find. These are some of the things, to look for. And it's not going to surprise us because by listening to the Bryan G Real Estate podcast, you have been properly prepped for your visit. A little shameless plug there. Sorry about that. Now let's move to the yard. So we're not only looking at the house, but we're also on this walkthrough, we're looking for the yard and the landscaping. Those beautiful potted plants that were sitting on the patio, right, are suddenly gone. And sometimes they leave, dirty marks of soil from watering them on the patio or by the front entrance, where they sat for years. Blooming flowers and lush landscaping make look less than if the seller was, if they had kind of backed off on taking care of their yard in the weeks prior to the closings, right? Now, some sellers think that they can take their foot off the gas pedal with the yard maintenance once they find, a buyer, right? And depending on the time of year, there could be more leaves and general debris versus other times, right? While going under contract does not relieve the seller of their obligations with regards to the yard upkeep and maintenance, we should expect that under certain circumstances that the yard maintenance may not be the same quality level as the time of our original showing or the home inspection, right? Now, sellers do have a responsibility to maintain the property within reason, right? While we're gone. But let's face it, if you're no longer the homeowner, right, you may have been really tight on that landscaping and edging every single time you mow and trimming those bushes perfectly. Well, it is reasonable that although we don't want the sellers to, and they shouldn't, let the yard just go out of control and grow wild, we should expect that, they were packing, getting ready to move to their next place, right? And so perhaps that yard's not going to look quite as tight, quite as crisp as it was before. Again, it needs to be reasonably maintained, but it might look differently from when they were trying to put their best foot forward when the home was listed and having showings. So we have to, again, have that expectation going in that the home in general may not look exactly how it did or as beautiful as it was when we had those showings or when we had a home inspection. Now, another part is cleanliness with the seller leaving. Now, some sellers are quite proactive and have their home professionally cleaned, upon moving out without even having to be asked, right? Some don't plan to do a thing unless their agent prods them to do so, right? Or pays for it. Can't say it wouldn't be the first time for me, right? And others, and then others say that will quote unquote sweep up after we move. Okay. Well, in most purchase agreements, set the minimum standard as broom swept condition. If you want a higher level of cleaning to be performed by the seller, that would need to be negotiated as part of our offer. Okay. So what is broom clean? That's basically, right, the seller moves all their stuff out of there, right? They get all their stuff out, and it would be not leaving the big dust bunnies, right? Not leaving muddy footprints walking through through the mud room and on the tile and stuff like that. So broom swept is, vacuum the carpets, sweep the floors, right? Or mop the floors, depending if it's tile or not, but just reasonably clean, just not trash, not overly dirty. There's not spilled food on the counter, right? Or anything gross like that, right? Now, like I said, people have different definitions of clean, right? So, the problem with evaluating the property condition after the seller moves out is that, what constitutes clean may be quite subjective, right? From one person to the next. A seller may think simply sweeping or dusting debris after, furniture has been removed is more than satisfactory. While another person might be appalled, right, at that and would never leave their home that way for any new homeowner, right? Which we do appreciate, right? Therefore, we must have a flexible mindset coming to the walkthrough, right? That not everybody's going to define clean the same way. That just because the buyer's standards of cleans may be higher than what the seller standard is, doesn't necessarily mean that it's unacceptable. Okay. We also need to keep in mind that the sellers are quite distracted, right? Once again, with the packing, their belongings, getting ready to move, working with the movers, family members coordinating their move, right? That, they're very busy also. And it's just one of those where I think we just need to, kind of seek to understand where both parties, buyers and sellers, where everybody's coming from. And I will say this, that in my, over a decade of doing this business or being in this business, is that I have never seen a home just trashed, awful, ugly. Like, you know what I mean? I haven't run into that yet. Okay. So now I have run into it where my sellers have left some stuff behind. We had to go back there and get it out of there before closing. Absolutely. We've done that. Again, paint cans, don't want it, stuff like that. Those stones in the garage I was talking about, right? We had to go get those. So I've run into that, but most people are very, very reasonable. And most people say to themselves, how would I want to accept this home if I were to buy her? And most everybody is very reasonable and very, very friendly about this. Okay. So now talking about trash and debris and unwanted items, right? So once again, it goes without saying that the seller should never leave unwanted items behind. However, the reality is many do, right? What I was saying before. So seeing things left on the sidewalk can be upsetting, right? But if it's out there for the trash pickup, I know it looks ugly, but if it's put out there for the trash, then, what are you going to do, right? Discovering unwanted trash or items lingering in the house can translate as a very lazy gesture on behalf of a seller, as well as their listing agent who did not proactively manage this, right? We usually reach out to the listing agent ahead of time. Okay, this is what I do. Okay, is I reach out to the agent ahead of time and just with a friendly reminder to, talk with their sellers about cleaning the home before the walkthrough and closing, right? Often, when we do come into a situation, um, that the listing agent had no idea that stuff was there or left behind, right? We're not living with the people, we're helping to sell their home, right? So we may not know that, right? So it's we need to be a little understanding, not just up to conclusion like, oh, this agent didn't do their job, blah blah blah, right? So sometimes our clients don't tell us everything. They might leave something without telling us or say they're going to do something and they don't, right? But that's why you have me, right? That's why when we see things that need to be done, that need to be addressed, that's why you have me as your buyer's agent to reach out to the listing agent and say, hey, we came across this. What can we do about it? Can we please get these things removed? What's the timeline? How can we help each other get this done? And good agents will collaborate together to make sure that we get that taken care of, because no agent wants any last minute hiccups or anything kind of derailing the goodwill of a transaction, right? We will work together. Most good agents do. And we'll work together to come with a good solution for everybody, for everything. Okay. Now, what happens if we have a situation where the seller has left something behind that was more than just a few, unused moving boxes or a couple of garbage bags, right? What if the seller has left a big pile of something, whatever that might be, that we can't get out of there? Now we have the final walkthrough, and it's like, look, someone's going to have to bring in a trailer to get the stuff out of the yard or out of the basement or something like that. Now, this brings us to the key exchange. Okay. If this is under the scenario that we're having to find a walkthrough just before the closing, so an hour before closing, right? We're here at the house, we're walking through, we walk into this garage and like, oh my goodness, they left all this stuff. They left all this junk. This is not something that someone can throw in the back of the car and take out real quick. There's no way this stuff's getting out of here before closing. Okay. Well, that's why we have our security deposit written into the purchase agreement. So if you're working with me as your buyer's agent, we always in our offer put in a security deposit, right? Saying that the home will be one, in acceptable condition, two, if anything is broken or trashed, that security deposit, it's like being a renter, right? Will pay for anything like that. Well, that security deposit can also be applied to unmoved items in there. If we go in there, there's a bunch of stuff in the garage. There's no way it's going to get out before closing. Then when we get to the closing, we're like, hey, we're not going to sign anything until we figure this out. Okay, Brian, what's the problem? Okay, so we went to the garage, there's all this stuff. And then the seller's usually like, oh, yeah, I kind of left all that, right? And they're kind of like, It's like, okay, so none of that's going to come out before we close. So we have a $2,000 security deposit. Look, let's give you back $1,500 out of that $2,000 security deposit. Then that allows my buyers, when they move in, and when they find, to get the keys here at closing, when they get there, they can call, College Hunks Moving Junk or something, right? They can hire a service to come in to get all that stuff out, right? So if there's something that big, that's when we have that security deposit to work with that can compensate the buyer to get the stuff out if the seller left something behind he can't get out before closing. Now the buyer may not want to do that. If the buyer insists that stuff is out before we close and they don't want to use the security deposit, they just want it gone, that could delay the closing. That hasn't happened with me yet. I've always been able to work something out with that in 10 years, right? But that can happen if the buyer does dig in their heels and say that stuff's got to be gone no matter what. I don't want to deal with the security deposit or deal with, someone hauling that stuff out. That could delay the closing. So sellers listening to this, okay, talk to your agent, right? I'm speaking now as the buyer's agent, but talk to your listing agent, right? I have this conversation with my sellers. Okay, we're getting close to closing. Make sure that all chattel that's not supposed to be there is gone. If it's not a fixture, if it's not nailed down or screwed down, it's got to go, right? And good agents will prepare their sellers and buyers appropriately for the final walkthrough. Okay. And it's good for us to mentally prepare ahead of time that sometimes we run into these issues, but also that we can negotiate amicably with the other agent. So we can work these things out. These weird things happen in real estate, and we agents are used to that. No 2 days are ever the same. There's always something crazy going on. I will never say I've seen it all because every time I say that to myself, something new comes up, right? So anyway, with two good agents involved, we can usually work things out and come up with a solution that'll be good for everybody. You're listening to the Bryan G Real Estate Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about me, check out my YouTube channel, Bryan Gutierrez Keller Williams Real Estate, or go to my Facebook page, Bryan Gutierrez Keller Williams. And if you want to hear more of this podcast, please subscribe. Now back to the show. Okay. And of course, we have the purchase agreement or contract as the guideline as to what those options are. And we can, work together and make those things happen. And 99.9% of the time, everything does work out okay. Okay. Now we have key fobs, the keys themselves, garage door openers, security codes, gate clickers, and access cards, things like that, right? While all these things are typically turned over to the buyer at the closing, you may get concerned if all these things have not been located and assembled or at least communicated about by the time of the walkthrough. Okay. The same goes for front door codes, or if it's keypad, as well as any instructions for accessing, smart home devices like, Nest thermostats, things like that, video doorbells, things, different items like that. We will verify that all of these items are given to you at the closing. So in this particular scenario that we're talking about, You may not see all the key fobs there. You may not see the keys sitting on the counter at the final walkthrough on our way to the closing. Okay. You may not see those things, but again, in this scenario, this is 9:30, closings at 10:30. We kind of make a note of these things like, okay, where are these things? Here's some questions that we have. When we get to the closing, oftentimes what I see is that the seller will have like a baggie, and they have the garage door openers in there, the extra keys. A lot of people will say, "Oh yeah, we left the instructions for the keypads and things like that in the far right kitchen cabinet." Right. And we left all the, owner's manuals, things like that. Right. So when we get to the closing, once again, we don't freak out until we talk to the people. So if we're like, okay, we don't see these items, let's make sure we ask them that at the closing. So while we're at the closing table, like I said, usually if we don't see them at the house on our way there, the seller will have them and they'll put it right on the table like, hey, here's all the extra stuff, boom, and hand it over to us, okay, at the closing. And also while we're at the closing, that's a great time to, after everyone signs all their paperwork and the title company's making all the copies for everyone, that copy time takes about 15 minutes or so. And so while they're running the copies for everyone to take home, that's a real great time for buyer and seller to get together, talk to each other, and ask those questions. Oh, hey, I see you have the nest. How do I do that? How do I access that? Right. And, sometimes, or not sometimes, a lot of times, buyers and sellers will exchange phone numbers if it's a nice, friendly situation, and be like, hey, give me a call if you have any questions. Here's my phone number or my email. Send me an email. And yeah, okay. So here's how the gate key things works. Again, I left, the owner's manuals in the kitchen cabinet or kitchen drawer, something like that. Right. And so while we're there with, buyers and sellers together at the closing, it's a real nice way while the title companies, making those copies after everyone is signed, we can all talk about those different things and exchange that contact info. And everyone is usually really, really good about, helping each other out. A lot of sellers, they want to be really nice. They love that home. They've been there for a long time. They want you, the buyers, to love that home as much as they did. And so I find that most people are very, very friendly and will help each other out. And that's a great time to meet, when we're at the closing and talk about those different things too. Now, that scenario was us having to find a walkthrough on our way the morning of to the closing, and you were getting the keys at closing. Well, that key exchange form would be signed at the closing table because you were getting the keys right then and there. Okay. And that's in your closing package. Now, what if we have a seller who needs 30 days to stay in the home for, say, just example, 30 days after the closing? Okay. So we have our home inspection, we do all that. Now, when it comes to the final walkthrough, we can do one of two things. One, we can have the final walkthrough. It is your right before the closing, like, the morning of or the day before the closing. However, if the sellers are staying in the home for another 30 days after closing, it may not really behoove us to have the walkthrough at closing because people are going to be there for another 30 days, right? Like all the real action is happening in the following 30 days or 2 weeks, whatever the amount is. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll just reserve the final walkthrough for the key exchange meeting. Okay. And here's what I mean by that. In this scenario, seller needs to stay in the home for 30 days after closing, and then we'll get the keys. So we go to the closing, everybody signs the paperwork, everything's fine. We close on the home. We have our security deposit, which is still in play now because their seller's still going to be in the home. So the title company is going to hold that security deposit in escrow until we exchange the keys 30 days later. Now, with occupancy agreement, it is on or before those 30 days. So seller asks for 30 days after closing. They might be ready to move in 3 weeks or maybe only 10 days, right? So it doesn't have to be that full 30 days, but they can use up to 30 days. So when it comes to the final walkthrough and the key exchange, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll just save that final walkthrough for the key exchange 30 days, after closing. right? Because if you have the walkthrough before, right at the closing, and the seller's still going to be in the home for another 30 days, right? You're not going to see anything, right? There's still furniture in the home. Maybe they're not even starting to pack yet. It's going to look just the same as it was, right? Well, the final walkthrough is what we want to see right before we get the keys, right? With everything out of the home and make sure everything's out of the home. So what I suggest doing in that case, if there's occupancy, is like, hey, we won't have the final walkthrough before the closing, but we will have the final walkthrough at our key exchange when the seller is ready to be out. So what we have is we have the closing, say it's 2.5 weeks later, the seller, through their agent contacts me and says, hey, we're going to be out in 2.5 weeks. We're ready to move out the day after tomorrow. Let's schedule the key exchange for the day after tomorrow at 10 a.m. Okay. Okay, great. No problem. So then I contact you, the buyer, and say, hey, we're ready to exchange the keys. The sellers got out a little bit earlier. Yay. So, hey, meet me tomorrow. I forgot what time I just said, but meet me tomorrow at 10 o'clock a.m. and we're going to go exchange the keys with the buyer. So what we do is at 10 a.m., we'll go there. And usually the sellers are there, right? And we show up too. I always like to go to every key exchange myself, just in case something weird comes up. Now, before we sign that key exchange, we're going to do our walkthrough through the house. Okay. So we get there. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. Hey, great to see you guys again. This is wonderful. It's awesome you guys are out early. Great. Yay. Shake hands, all of that. Okay, awesome. All right, we're just going to run through the house real quick and we'll meet you in the kitchen, right? So then we just do our walkthrough. We walk through, make sure everything's in order, make sure the 4 walls are still standing, nothing got trashed, make sure all of our fixtures and appliances are there, right? Now we just do our walkthrough. We go out on the patio in the backyard, we look around, make sure everything's okay. We go through the garage, basement, make sure everything's been removed. And if the home is in reasonable condition, then we beat up and, on the kitchen counter, we say, okay, the home looks great. Hey, sellers, thank you so much for keeping the home in great condition. We really, really appreciate it. Here's the key exchange form. We all sign the form, and then the seller exchanges the keys or hands them to the buyer and say, okay, the house is yours. Now, just like another walkthrough, if there is an issue or there is a problem, we have that security deposit still in play. If something's not right, if something's not moved and something needs to be paid for, if there's some damage or anything like that, we do have that security deposit and we'll work something out right there at the key exchange. Both of us agents, seller and buyers are there. We're like, hey, that window wasn't broken, when we had the home inspection, right? And they'll be like, oh yeah, my nephew was moving a chair and bumped the window and put a crack in it. Okay, great. Well, how about if we keep, $300 to help replace that window out of the security deposit. So then we can buy a new window later. And the seller will be like, okay, great. And then we'll note that on the key exchange because the key exchange form goes to the title company. The title companies disperse all the funds. So the title company has the funds in escrow, remember? And so what we do is if we see something we don't like, we come up to a monetary agreement at that point and say, the seller will be like, all right, fine, I'll give you $300 for that window. Great. We note it on the key exchange form. Everybody signs and initials it, right? And then when that goes to the title company, they see, and also I'll have a phone conversation as I'm sending it over, letting them know what the scenario was, and that X amount of dollars go to the buyer, X amount of dollars go to the seller. And because everybody signed it, it's all in agreement, and we move forward from there. If you're getting the home at closing, if you're getting the keys at closing, we have the final walkthrough like the day before, the day of the closing, to make sure everything's in good condition. If the seller is staying in the home for X amount of time occupancy after closing, then we can reserve that final walkthrough for the key exchange. Okay, so there's 2 ways that we can do that. And basically what it comes down to with this is whatever we feel is reasonable is right. And most people are like that. Like I said, I've had very, very few problems with key exchanges, with final walkthroughs. Most everybody is very reasonable. They want to be nice. They want to treat each other well. But occasionally some things do come up. Some things do happen. And we do need to negotiate through those. But that's okay because good agents will do that. We will collaborate. We will work together for both the buyer and the seller to make sure that everything works out for us okay. So anyway, that's the breakdown of the final walkthrough and the key exchange. And I really hope this was helpful. A big part of my job is setting expectations for you buyers, for you sellers, so that when you come into a new situation or a new phase of the transaction, that you know what to reasonably expect so that you're not surprised or shocked when we finally get there. Anyway, thank you so much.